That morning seemed like any other, but the peace lasted exactly 5 seconds, because when my eyes fixed on the horizon, I almost let the cup slip out of my hand. A neighborhood. There, where once there had been nothing but open land, an entire condominium had sprung up, rows and rows of newly built houses, with aligned roofs and identical white fences, fake green lawns, uniform mailboxes, garages copied from each other. Everything was so artificial and standardized that it looked like a plastic neighborhood straight out of a trashy real estate advertisement. But the most important detail? They were all on my land. I blinked several times, trying to understand. Was I dreaming? Had I woken up in a parallel universe? Because, as far as I knew, I hadn't authorized anyone to build a damn neighborhood on my property. I stood up slowly, feeling the anger rising in my chest like wildfire. Who the hell had the audacity to build 96 houses in my backyard? The answer came on its own. The HOA, or rather, the woman who ran the HOA like a medieval queen. That woman had been trying to intimidate me for months. First, there were the polite warnings. Formal notes in my mailbox, always written in that disgusting tone. Your property is not up to community standards. We ask that you consider joining the HOA to maintain neighborhood harmony. Your property is disrupting the aesthetics of the neighborhood. I laughed and threw each one in the trash. Then came the attempts at coercion. More aggressive notices, with veiled threats to take action if I didn't follow the HOA's rules. One woman even had the gall to show up at my gate once, trying to convince me that I should sell my land because it didn't fit in with the development of the neighborhood. I told her to fuck off and went back inside. And then, when they realized I was never going to give in, they simply decided to ignore my existence and build on top of my land. I stood on the balcony, looking at this suburban nightmare that had sprung up overnight, feeling my patience evaporate. She thought she could do it. She really thought she could ignore the rightful owner of the land, get on with the construction, and hope that I would simply accept the absurdity. But there was one detail she didn't know. I was waiting for exactly that. She thought I was an inattentive farmer, an idiot who doesn't notice when someone is trying to get in over their head. But while she was building each of those 96 houses, she had no idea that she was falling right into my trap. I picked up my phone and dialed a number that had been saved for months. The person on the other end answered on the first call. It happened. I heard a short, satisfied laugh. Did they really build it? I looked again at those perfectly lined-up houses, the physical representation of the HOA's arrogance. Down to the last tile. The silence on the other side lasted a second before the definitive answer. So now, it's time to collect. I smiled. If the HOA thought it could fool me, build a neighborhood on my land, and get away with it, I was about to learn the worst lesson of her life. My patience was already wearing thin when this woman started inundating me with those damn HOA notices. But now she had crossed the line in a way that even I didn't think was possible. I stood on the balcony, staring at that aberration of a neighborhood, feeling my anger grow with each identical roof my eyes traveled over. 96 houses that shouldn't be there, on my land, and those people had the nerve to build as if I didn't exist. The phone was still in my hand, and on the other end of the line, I heard my contact's voice repeat the question. So, they really built everything? Every fucking brick. That's great. That means they signed their own sentence. My smile was cold. Did she think she could play dirty? Then I was going to show her how to play for real, because what the HOA didn't know was that every one of those houses was now in my hands. I hung up the phone and got in my truck. It was time to make my visit. The new neighborhood still had that fresh smell of construction. Some of the houses were already occupied, while others were still in the process of being finished. Workers were moving around, carrying materials, painting walls, installing doors. And of course, in the middle of the mess, there she was, the queen of the HOA, standing with a clipboard in her hand, overseeing everything as if she were a real estate entrepreneur. I got out of the car calmly, watching as she gave orders to one of the workers about the exact color the gates should be. The man nodded and hurried off. Only then did she notice me. The smile of superiority she wore disappeared at the same moment. "What are you doing here?" she asked, clutching the clipboard to her chest. I crossed my arms, in no hurry. "I think you already know," she snorted and put one hand on her waist. "If you're here to cause trouble, I'll let you know that we're legal." Laughter escaped before I could stop it. "Legal? You built an entire neighborhood on my land without my permission, and you think you're legal?" Her face hardened. Her land was abandoned. It was a waste of space. The HOA decided it was better to use it to benefit the community. I looked around at the cloned houses, the generic structure, the soulless environment that she called community. Benefit the community, eh? That's funny, because I don't remember selling my property. She blinked, the first crack in her confidence beginning to show. Well, there was a restructuring of the area. Restructuring? She hesitated. I was enjoying watching her brain desperately trying to find a way out. The HOA approved the development of this area as part of an expansion project. You don't answer to the HOA, but your property is still within the boundaries of the community. So we made a deal to use the space. I let out a short laugh. An agreement? That's funny, because I didn't sign shit. She opened and closed her mouth, without replying. The truth was simple. They were counting on my ignorance. The HOA built the houses believing that I had no control over the legality of the land. But what they didn't know was that, from the first stupid note this woman sent me, I was already prepared for this. Here's the problem, darling. I took an envelope out of my pocket and slipped it into her hand. She frowned and opened it, her eyes quickly scanning the papers. And that's when horror took over her face. This can't be real. The taste of victory was already in my mouth. It's more than real. The land still belongs to me. She began to turn the pages of the document as if she were going to find some loophole, some miraculous way out. But there wasn't, because while she was busy trying to push the HOA on me, I was registering every inch of my land with new, reinforced documentation. And now, every one of the 96 illegally built houses was on my property. She finally looked up at me, completely pale. "What do you want?" I smiled, crossing my arms. "Simple. Now all the residents of these houses will have to pay me rent." Her silence was priceless. The woman was holding the papers so tightly that her hands were shaking. Her eyes ran along the lines of the document as if, by some miracle, she could find an error, a loophole, anything that would save her from this mess. But there was no way out. She finally looked at me, completely pale. "You can't do that." I laughed. "I can, and I will." She blinked a few times, as if trying to process the size of the shit she'd gotten herself into. "These houses are part of the community. The families are already moving in. The contracts have already been signed. You can't just charge them rent." I crossed my arms and tilted my head. "The point is quite simple. They're on my land. That makes me the owner of all of them. And if people want to continue living here, they'll have to pay me." Her eyes were wide with horror, because now the tables had turned completely. She wanted to force me to accept the HOA's rules. She wanted to bend me, humiliate me, make me swallow her prefabricated community. But in the end, it was she who fell to her knees. "This is extortion," she shouted, trying to regain control of the conversation. "I'm taking this to court." I shrugged. "Good. Let's see how a judge reacts. Let's see how a judge will react to the fact that you built an entire neighborhood without authorization, on land that didn't belong to you. Let's see who loses." Her face crumpled, because she knew I was right. If the HOA took this to court, they'd be the ones screwed. They would be the ones who would have to pay for every house built illegally, every penny spent on the work, every contract signed with no legal basis. And that wasn't even the worst thing. The worst thing was the scandal. I could already imagine the local newspapers reporting it. HOA builds neighborhood illegally, and now has to pay millions to the real owner of the land. Families cheated. Residents discover they have to pay rent to stay in the houses they bought. And best of all, her name would be in every headline. She took a deep breath, squeezing her eyes shut, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. "What do you want?" The sound of victory. I smiled, crossing my arms and pretending to think. "I want what belongs to me. I want an official contract, signed by the HOA and the new residents, guaranteeing that all the occupants of these houses will pay me rent." She widened her eyes. "You want to make the HOA your tenant?" "That's right." The woman looked like she was about to explode. "That's absurd." "What's absurd is that you thought you could take something of mine without consequence. But don't worry. As I'm a reasonable guy, I'll give you a discount." She blinked, suspicious. "What kind of discount?" "I'll charge a fair price. Nothing exorbitant. Just enough to ensure that every penny you've spent on this construction hasn't been wasted. What if the HOA refuses to pay? Then you can explain to the residents why they'll have to move out of the houses they bought." She turned pale, because now there was no way out. If she tried to fight me, the residents themselves would come after her. If she tried to ignore it, I had the legal right to evict them all. And if she wanted to sue me, she'd end up destroying the HOA's reputation forever. She had no choice, but she still tried one last card. "You can't do this to these families. They bought these houses in trust." My smile disappeared. "And I'm the villain now? Me? I didn't steal anything. I didn't build houses on land that doesn't belong to me. I didn't cheat anyone." She lowered her head. "You have 48 hours to sort this out. If I don't receive a signed contract by then, the evictions will begin." I turned my back and walked away. I knew she was standing there, watching my truck disappear down the road, feeling the weight of her humiliation. Now I owned the whole neighborhood. And Karen? Now she was nothing. The HOA thought it could bend me over. They thought they could steal my land, build an entire neighborhood without my permission, and get away with it. But now they were in my hands. Karen had spent a lifetime bossing other people around, manipulating neighbors, levying ridiculous fines, feeling at the top of the food chain because she controlled half a dozen houses with white picket fences. But now she was about to find out what happens when you mess with the wrong person. The next morning, the first residents began to discover the truth. The neighbors whispered. The first rumors spread like wildfire. It was impossible to hide the reality. The houses didn't belong to them. People began to come to me, one by one. First, a couple in the house on the corner. Then a retired man who had recently moved in. They all had the same question on their minds. "Is this true?" And I made sure to answer as calmly as I could. "Yes, you're on my land." The residents panicked. Some began to question Karen directly. Others, more outraged, threatened to sue the HOA. Best of all, I didn't have to do anything. The HOA's own incompetence was destroying Karen right before my eyes. At the end of the second day, my phone rang. We needed to talk. It was Karen. Her voice was no longer arrogant. It didn't have that usual tone of superiority. Now she was terrified. "Good," I replied, without emotion. "Bring the contracts." When I arrived at the HOA office that afternoon, Karen was already sitting at the table, her eyes deep, the papers spread out in front of her. The woman looked years older. Her arrogance was in tatters. She handed me a bundle of documents with trembling hands. "Here are the contracts." I took the first paper and read it slowly. That's exactly what I asked for. The residents will pay rent. The HOA will be responsible for passing on the monthly amounts. In return, you undertake not to evict anyone. I gave a short smile. "You've finally learned to obey." She turned red, but didn't say anything. "Sign it." She swallowed and picked up the pen. Her hands were shaking, but she signed every page. Each signature was a brick in the HOA's coffin. When she finished, I slid the papers to my side of the table. "Congratulations. Now the HOA officially pays rent to me." Her face was ashen. She knew I had won, but I wasn't finished yet. "Now we have another matter to discuss." She looked up, suspicious. "What?" I put another piece of paper on the table. She picked it up and started reading. Her expression changed instantly. "You can't be serious." I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. "I bought the rights to the HOA. Now I'm the new president." Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. You can't, but I can." I put my feet up on the table, amused by the sheer desperation in her eyes. "You wanted to force me into the HOA? That's right. Now I control the HOA." Karen stood up so quickly that the chair almost fell backwards. "You can't do that." "Yes, I can." The board accepted my offer. "Most HOA members sold their shares to me because they were tired of your incompetent leadership." She blinked several times, trying to absorb the information. But, don't worry. You don't have to worry about rules, notifications, and meetings anymore. Because as of today," I stood up from my chair, picking up my papers. "You're expelled from the HOA." Her face turned completely colorless. "What? You're out. You're out. Expelled. Removed. You're no longer in charge of anything." She started shaking her head desperately. "No! That's impossible." "It's very possible. In fact, it's already happened. You are officially banned from the HOA." Karen stumbled backwards, as if she had been punched in the stomach. The silence in the office was delicious. She had spent years thinking she was at the top, controlling the neighborhood, deciding what could and couldn't be done. But now, it was all over. She had lost the HOA. She lost the neighborhood she tried to build. She'd lost everything. She stared at me, her eyes full of hatred, but she didn't say anything. She just picked up her things and left the office, defeated. And I stayed there, sitting in the chair that was now mine, in charge of the HOA that now belonged to me. In the end, she wanted to force me to accept the rules, but I was the one who ended up writing the new rules. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.